Today we have a highly requested video. We are going to talk about the ESPRESSO grinders, all of them, or at least the ones I think that are most important in the current lineup. As you probably know, ESPRESSO is kind of an extreme company. They operate a little bit like a smartphone brand with new releases and flagship models, premium models, budget models released more or less constantly. And it can be difficult to keep up to date with the current lineup, even for people who talk about coffee all the time. So in front of me I have the ESPRESSO grinders that I think you should be aware of. You could probably call them the top models of 21, and I think for the next year these will also be the grinders that you should consider if you want an ESPRESSO grinder. So in front of me we have the ESPRESSO Q2, we have the K-Max, which was released only a few months ago, and we have the JX, which has been with us for a few years. And finally we have the J-Max, which is also a brand new release from 2021. I should say that the company has sent the J-Max to me for review, but these three models here I have bought for my own money. Okay, but let's start from one end and then go through the grinder one by one. So here we have the Q2 grinder. This is the smallest and cheapest grinder from ESPRESSO. I think you should consider this grinder if you have small hands or you want a very compact grinder to use for travel. This grinder is smaller than most of the other ESPRESSO grinders, so it also means that it's a bit slower to use. It only has 38mm burrs, and obviously they're not going to be as fast as the bigger versions out there. This particular model in front of me uses what is called heptagonal burrs. This is actually a very limited edition. So far it has only been available in the Chinese market. And the Q2 that you can buy on ESPRESSO's website or on Amazon uses a different burr set. These burrs are called pentagonal burrs. So there are some differences between these two burr sets that you should be aware of. Unfortunately, the heptagonal burr set is quite difficult to find at the moment. It's sold out a lot of places, and I guess it will be more of a collector's item in the future. So heptagonal is a 7-sided burr and pentagonal is a 5-sided burr. The 5-sided burr is actually used in a lot of hand grinders, among them the Timor C2 and the Heller 101. They use very similar burrs. These burrs are pretty good for pour-over. They're not really ideal for espresso. It takes forever to grind for espresso with that geometry, but for drip coffee they're definitely okay. The heptagonal burrs are just a little bit cleaner. They have a more narrow particle distribution, and in fact in my testing inside this grinder the heptagonal burr set has shown to be the most consistent of all the ESPRESSO grinders. I have heard rumors that ESPRESSO are currently working on an upgraded heptagonal burr set that they will launch sometime during the next year, but at the moment I think it's difficult to find them. So if you want a smaller grinder, then you probably have to go for the standard burrs. Again, as I mentioned, the standard burrs are definitely not bad, but they just aren't as consistent as the ones inside this grinder here. Unless you're brewing really light roasted coffees at a 1:17, 1:18 ratio, I don't think you'll notice a huge difference. But if you are a hardcore coffee snob, you might be able to tell the difference. So just to give you a little bit of a reference of how fast this grinder is, I'll grind 12 grams, which is probably around what most people would use for a single cup of coffee. And we're done now. It was around 32-33 seconds, so not the slowest grinder, but also not the fastest of all. The next grinder we're going to talk about is the JX. JX is just a little bit more expensive than the Q2, but for most people I think it will be a better experience in daily use. It's a very popular grinder and for a good reason. It grinds very fast, it's very consistent. You can use it for both drip coffee and espresso. It looks pretty good, at least to me, and it's nice to hold, nice in the hand, and it just feels like a very sturdy grinder. Let me just show you how fast this grinder can go through 12 grams of coffee. and it was around 13, 14, 15 seconds. So it's almost a 1 second per gram grinder, at least if you have adjusted it to the pour over AeroPress setting. For espresso, it's also very fast. It's around 2 seconds per gram. So let's say you have a dose of 18 grams of coffee. It will be around 35, 36 seconds to go through it. The JX is just a really good all-round grinder. I think it's the cheapest grinder that will get you into both really good filter coffee and espresso at the same time. Of course, there are going to be better grinders out there. For espresso, if you go up to something like a BREW, a Eureka Mignon, you're already getting better flavors. And for pour over, of course, flat burr grinders will also do a better job. But on the other hand, I think it can compete and even beat most entry-level electric grinders, for example, Baratza Encore or Virtuoso. I think the JX will do a better job. The JX came out in 2019, and 1Zpresso has improved the model over the years. So it has a slightly different handle, slightly different grip and adjustment system compared to the first models. I think it's all to the better, and yeah, it's just a very solid, refined product now. I even think that the adjustment mechanism is pretty suitable for espresso. It doesn't have quite the same granularity as the JX Pro, the big brother, but compared to the first generation of the JX, it's been improved a lot. So I think unless you're super picky, you'll be able to dial in your shot reasonably well. I will say, if you consider the Comandante with red clicks as being suitable for espresso, then you will be able to get the same kind of granularity with the new upgraded JX. Also, I think we're in a different place in coffee nowadays. I don't think we're in that same old paradigm as before, where you wanted to be able to dial in the grinder completely perfectly and then just pull coffee from the hopper. So I think as long as you can get into the ballpark where you need to be for espresso, then you'll be able to dial in the rest by using some other parameters. Also, many of us use lever machines, so of course that's going to be different from an electric pump machine. Many people also like more modern espresso, like turbo shots or lungos, allongés, all these things. And again, it's not about being 100% dialed into precision. It's more about just going with the flow. So that kind of old school mentality where you needed a certain amount of coffee in a certain amount of time. If you're already doing single dosing and you're into more modern espresso, I honestly think it's overrated. You might be wondering why I don't have the JX Pro with me here today, but the reason is simply that I don't really feel that it's that great a model to recommend anymore. So at a cheaper price you have the JX, which is basically the same grinder except for the adjustment system. And then on the other hand, you have the new JMax model here, which is just $40 more expensive than the JX Pro, but is a better grinder in a lot of different ways. So the JX Pro is still a great grinder. I just don't think it's that easy to recommend it anymore as it used to be. Now let's talk a little bit about the JMax, which is the new top of the line espresso grinder from 1Zpresso. The JMax was released in the middle of 2021 and has already become a quite popular grinder among coffee geeks. It has a crazy adjustment system, which sits here on the outside, so you can just adjust it by turning the top of the grinder like this. Each click is only 8.8 microns, which is probably the most granular of any hand grinder on the market at the moment. I would actually go as far as saying that it's even better than a stepless grinder, because it's a lot easier to retrace your old settings with these ultra small steps you have here. Overall, it's just really nice to use. The only thing that can be a little bit tricky is if you want to go from, let's say, your coarsest setting and back to espresso, then sometimes you can be a little bit confused about where you are, because actually you have to go 2 rotations. So it's important to take a little look at this little pyramid that they have on the side, which will indicate exactly where you are. The JMax has a lot of improvements compared to the JX Pro. For instance, it has this longer, nicer handle with this really well-made wooden knob. It also has a magnetic catch cup, which is really nice, and then it has less static than the JX Pro. The burrs are also slightly different. It's a little bit of a different geometry, and then the burrs are coated, which means they're gonna last longer. While it's a different flavor compared to the JX and JX Pro, The geometry of the burrs is still pretty similar, so it's not like the flavor is completely different. Overall, I will say that it's a little bit better suited for espresso and maybe a little bit more inconsistent for drip coffee. That being said, it's still very enjoyable. You can get great pour over, AeroPress, all these things. So if you want to use it as an all-round grinder, it works totally fine for that. Like many of the other ESPRESSO grinders, it's super fast, so let me just demonstrate for you. Again, we had 12 grams of coffee and we are done in 14-15 seconds, so very comparable to the JX. I will even say in some ways it's nicer to grind with because this handle is a bit longer, so you just have more leverage. Some people don't like the ergonomics of the JMax that much. It's a pretty wide grinder, and I've heard people complain that you could accidentally touch the adjustment or knock off the magnetic catch cup. But personally for me it hasn't been a problem, but if you have small hands then it might be an issue. Overall, I will say this is an all-round grinder. It has an espresso focus, but you can use it for everything. So if you're choosing between this and the JX, then I would probably choose this one here if you're making more espresso and you like that quality of life improvement, such as the adjustment and the magnetic catch cup, because those things are pretty nice in daily use. And finally, we're going to talk about the K-Max, which is the newest of all the grinders. It only came out a few months ago, but in some ways it's not a huge revolution because it has a lot of things in common with the K Plus and the J-Max. So it's kind of a mix between these two, but with a few cool differences. So I've already made a review of the K Plus before, and you can find it if you look up here somewhere. But basically the K-Max takes a lot of the same things and just improves a little bit upon them. There's the external adjustment system, there's a magnetic catch cup, it also has this new color similar to the J-Max, and the same handle with the bigger, more luxurious wooden knob. This is also a 48mm burr grinder. These burrs are quite different from the burrs inside the J-Max and JX. The burrs look a little bit like what's used in the Comandante C40, and they also taste a little bit more like those. Although I will say it's still a very different grinder. There are some subtle differences compared to the K Plus that are worth mentioning. So for instance, the catch cup here is slimmer, and it doesn't have this built-in blind shaker that the K Plus used. There's also a rubber mat, like an anti-slip thing underneath, which is actually pretty nice. The burr stopper is also designed slightly different. ESPRESSO says this is to help reduce static, and it seems to be a little bit better in this regard. From the first versions of the K Plus, there's also a little bit of a difference to the burr. So if you have the newest K Plus, you're gonna experience the same flavors here, but compared to the K Plus I tried before, this actually has a slightly different flavor profile, which I find way better for espresso, and also slightly better for drip coffee. In my opinion, there's no doubt that the K-Max is the new flagship grinder from ESPRESSO. It is one of their most expensive grinders, not quite as expensive as the K Plus, but the real difference is the catch cup, and I think you'll be more happy with this solution after all, because that blind shaker thing, I mean, it's pretty cheap to buy on Amazon or AliExpress if you really want to use that for your distribution. K-Max just feels very nice in the hand. It's a bit more slim, it has nice ergonomics, and it's very suitable for all kinds of coffee. Once again, let's just do a little speed test so we can see how it works in daily life. And we're done around 15-16 seconds. So just a tiny bit slower than the JX or JMax, but of course it could also just be my technique. I think in daily use you're not really gonna notice any difference. If I am to compare it to the JMax, I think it's a little bit nicer to use. It has a small slim body which is easier to hold, You don't have the same granularity, but that's actually also a good thing in a way, because that means that you have all the adjustments that you need on a single rotation. So it's a little bit easier to go back and forth between espresso and other brewing methods, whereas you can be a little bit lost if you're using the J-Max. The J-Max is 8.8 microns and K-Max is 22 microns. It sounds like a big difference, and in a sense it is, but on the other hand, I still don't feel like you're struggling to find the right adjustment when you're dialing in espresso with the K-Max. Between the two, they do have different flavors. It's hard to say that one is just outright better than the other. K-Max is probably the more modern tasting. It's like the espresso bandwidth is more compressed, so you feel the espresso flavors more in a centralized area in your mouth, whereas the J-Max, it feels like it's kind of coating your whole palate, so to speak. This can suit some coffees, but for other coffees it can be a little bit astringent feeling, and here the K-Max might be a bit more pleasant. So I think if you're more like a modern light roast person, you like turbo shots, allongés, these kind of things, then you're probably gonna enjoy K-Max more. And if you're a bit more old school, then you're probably gonna prefer the J-Max. So as I said, I think the K-Max is probably the best out of the bunch, but it's really close. The improvements with the K-Max is mainly down to nicer adjustment, better catch cup, nicer ergonomics. So if we compare it to the JX, I actually think you get a lot of your money by going up to this grinder here. But if you prefer to stay with the JX, you're not missing out that much in terms of coffee. It's more when it comes to small quality of life improvements that the K-Max has the upper hand. Okay, I think it's time to wrap this one up here. As we've seen in this little video, there's more or less an ESPRESSO grinder for everybody. And I don't really think you can go wrong with any of them. That is, unless you have small hands, then you probably shouldn't go with the J-Max or the JX. Then you should consider the Q2 or this one here instead. But overall, I think most people would have a pretty good experience with any of the grinders. If you already own an ESPRESSO grinder, I don't think there's necessarily any reason to feel sad that you don't have one of the newest models. Even the old ones are still very popular. I know a lot of coffee forum bros go crazy for the E series and the C series that were phased out a long time ago. And the JE series, which is made for espresso, is also soon going to be phased out. So ESPRESSO are not going to produce them anymore. And I still think those grinders are excellent. So what's your opinion of ESPRESSO grinders? Do you already have one, and do you have some tips you want to share with the other viewers? Or do you have any questions? Then let me know down in the comment section below. That's it for today. I'll see you in another coffee video very soon.